Hello, and welcome to another episode of Thoroughly Thriving, where talent meets strategy and innovation drives success. On today's episode, we will take a deep dive into the world of human capital solutions, explore the latest trends in recruitment, and share actionable insights to help businesses grow and thrive. Whether you're a seasoned executive, a budding entrepreneur, or just passionate about the future of work, you are in the right place. Well, let's get started on building the future, one conversation at a time.
Well, welcome everyone to another episode of Thoroughly Thriving. I'm here with Darren. Darren, how are you today?
I'm doing great, Sean. I'm excited for another episode of Thoroughly Thriving, especially given today's topic.
Yeah, I know it's a topic we're both very, very passionate about. It's something that's very, very important for organizations, no matter what the hiring season is, no matter the size of the organization. It's something that's really, really important. And we're going to talk about a buzzword today. We're going to talk about something that you hear quite a bit about in our culture and our society, no pun intended. But we're going to talk about culture in your organization as a part of your hiring process, as a part of the way you review candidates, as a part of the way your candidates review you. You know, culture is such an important thing, even in considering candidates, to take a look at and think about, are they a culture fit or are they a culture add, right? And really having that right perspective around your culture and how your company is viewed for the hiring process. So I know this is something you're super passionate about and super excited about, Darren. Tell me a little bit about, why you're so passionate about culture.
Sean, if I could just try to encapsulate what culture is, and then I like the question that you posed, culture fit versus culture add. So I'd want to take some time to talk about the delineation between the two because there is. Um, but culture is not what you create, it's what you tolerate. And we've talked about this in previous episodes, but throughout my career, and I'm sure certainly through yours, we've had the honor and privilege of working with so many countless companies throughout, really the journey that we've been partnering with companies in healthcare and life sciences. And what I've been able to really gather, glean, identify, and recognize is culture, again, is the things that you kind of ignore. So when we're working with a company, it's important for us to have that transparent conversation so we can properly identify if this is going to be a culture fit for a role or culture add to an organization. Now, some might say, well, aren't they one and the same? Depending on the infrastructure, depending on the dynamics within your organization. But you're right, culture is a buzzword, but it's important for us when we're partnering with companies to understand that dynamic as thoroughly as we can. Because I'll tell you, it allows us to really calibrate, hone in, refine. Not only are we finding the right technical fit, but are we finding the right cultural fit? And Sean, a buzzword that's been prevalent since I've been in the industry for 20 years now is, we're looking for someone with really strong soft skills. Have you heard that, Sean? The soft skills.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
But I'd like to shift the paradigm on that, Sean. I like to shift that because I really call them power skills. What you bring to the table from a cultural dynamic, from a cultural perspective, from a cultural approach, it's nothing soft about it, because you're either going to be a culture add or detraction. That's been my estimate. Um, I'm curious for you, Sean, given your extensive experience, um, the question that you pose, cultural add versus fit, how do you kind of work through that? Have there been times in your career where a client comes to you and says, Sean, we're looking for someone to not only fit this need, but add to the culture. And how do you consult, really coach, advise through add versus fit?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, Darren. And I think culture is something that I think a lot of organizations are very, very proud of, and they should be because it's intentional, to your point. Whether we're subconsciously willing to admit it or not, it's the things that we tolerate, it's the things that we allow. And I know even for us as we've, started setting the culture for Thorough Group and really considering some of those hard questions, we have to be more intentional. And so I think companies have built years and years of intentionality around their culture. Sometimes it's collaborative, or it's, something where it's very collegial, or it's something where, there's a lot of, top down or side to side. There's a lot of mentorship available. There's all these different aspects that companies look at as a part of their culture. And so you have to consider the separate aspects of culture fit really being the things that are not going to detract from the culture that you've already built. And so, as long as they are a fit to the culture, meaning that they're not going to be like sandpaper, constantly causing friction and other things, that, I found in my career that people who are top and high producers in organizations, if they are friction, there's nothing wrong with good debate. I think it's good to challenge things. I think it's good to, continue to bar raise across the organization. But, when you have that friction among your people, no matter how smart they are, no matter how great their systems are, their strategies, or whatever it may be, it can slow your ability to build progress, to build success, to build some of those other things. So I understand why companies look for culture fits. I think on the other side of the coin, when you think about culture ads, is how do you boost an already healthy culture? How do you grow and expand and bring in the right personnel who not only fit your current culture, but now bar raise and set the culture to another level, that they challenge everyone else to come up in a good way, right? They help to press forward. We work largely with, early phase, biotech and pharmaceutical device companies that are in that development phase. They're not to commercial yet. They don't have products on the market. They haven't grown into that scale. And so they're always on that precipice of we need to hire for today to accomplish the work we're doing today, but always with one eye on, can this person add value and be a culture add to where we plan to go as well? And so that's how really we try to work through, at least from my experience with building with a client, is looking not just at culture today, but what does culture for next year look like? What does culture for Q4 of this year, or Q1 of next year, or Q4 of next year even look like? Because, you may be able to have someone who fits the culture today, but what if you can get someone who fits the culture today, but also is a culture add for where you're going? Because you know that you're going to need to scale up. You know you're going to need to expand globally, or you're going to need to expand outside of the footprint of your small office in the Bay Area or San Diego or Boston or whatever it may be. And, so getting the right person that can help be the bridge to your future culture as well, I think is how I really look at culture add. But, I would say on your end, what are your thoughts in terms of working the difference between the two?
I'm going to expand on that a bit because in our industry, you just mentioned, or in the niches that we focus in with early stage, early phase type companies, oftentimes our clients are acquired, right? And so either for their compounds, their assets, and now having worked with so many companies that are on the other side of being acquired, one of the things that we've been notified and made known of through that process is yes, they're acquiring them for their compounds, their assets, their programs, but also who's coming with those compounds, assets, and programs. Are they collaborative, right? Are they open to really kind of reaching, extending their hands out and helping one another? What's that culture within these organizations? So when you think about looking forward, when you think about the mid to long term, that's important too. Just given the type of companies that we work with too, like when either a VC is investing money into a company, right, or a big pharma company is looking to acquire, they want to ensure that that doesn't erode, detract, dilute their culture too. Or if it's a venture capitalist company, right? If they're investing into a company, does that align with their portfolio of companies too, from a cultural perspective? So I think that's where the ad comes in, not so much the fit, because I look at ad as more as a macro level, and fit, could be for a group function or role, just for that right fit. But again, there's got to be clear assimilation that occurs across the board. So it's very, very interesting, and there's an aspect in our industry where things can be commoditized, right? Where they're just acquiring, like I mentioned, the programs or the assets, perhaps the compounds, but there's that element, that human element that comes along with that too. So I thought it was worth mentioning.
Yeah, well, and so tell me your thought around, because I know that companies look at culture as a part of the way that they hire. They look at a candidate as a fit. Tell me a little bit about what companies, if they're not careful, can demonstrate a culture to candidates that can affect whether candidates have interest in their organization.
Great question. Great question. A big part of our role in supporting these companies is being a consultant, right? Because we're an extension of these companies. Certainly, when they engage us to represent them, and I believe that the number one barometer is communication, having clear communication, having really, really on time, real time communication as much as possible. Now, what I mean by that is when we're engaged with a client and we're working on a high level search, which is typically the case, we like to set uh, we want to come into alignment with expectations of how the process is going to work to not only really attract clients or candidates rather, because that's what we need to do, but then how are they going to be engaged? Now, if we have clients that, for a lack of a better term, aren't quick in their feedback, aren't quick in moving candidates along in a process, even given today's market. It's a very, very challenging market still with, let's just be very transparent, with how many candidates are on the market right now, right? It still takes quite a bit to find that right cultural ad. So a good perception or a good optics is we really encourage our clients to expedite their communication, to work perspective, culture, ads through the process in an expedited fashion, because that could convey to a candidate not interested. And then who here knows for our listeners that your network is really your net worth, right? And what I mean by that is if a candidate has been told that the process is going to look like it's going to be 2 weeks, but they haven't gotten feedback in 3 weeks or 4 weeks, well, word starts to spread across their network. So I think it's important, right, for hiring companies to be aligned to move candidates through the process as quickly as possible, because that's not only going to benefit the candidate, but certainly the company too.
Yeah, no, it's interesting how you mentioned that. I remember when I was newer into the business, and I remember sitting down over lunch with a chief medical officer, and I remember something I'll never forget. He told me he had been in industry for a while and had been in a few different organizations, and he said, you'll quickly understand that we move at different speeds than you want to move. And he told me a story about a VP of clinical development that he had hired recently, and he took on the search himself, and he was working through the process. He worked with HR, he got everything written up and posted and kind of walked through the journey. And I remember he said to me that he called the candidate back after the interview process and wanted to make him an offer. But because they had taken weeks to get processed through everything to get back to him, the candidate's response was, "Oh, I thought you'd already moved on and hired someone else since I hadn't heard from you in weeks." And he was blown away because it was the fastest that their organization had ever gone from job description creation to offer making in the history of the company. And he said there's always that differentiating dynamic between the speed that the client wants to move and the speed that the candidate wants to move. And so it's always stuck with me that there's a required education, because companies do build reputations in the marketplace, for different cultural things, mostly good, but there are things that people will, begin to talk through. And, I recently spoke to a head of QA at a company in the Bay Area, and he was telling me about the interview process that he had gone into, for being hired. And it was 16 interviews over the course of 6 weeks, meeting with a variety of different people. And it was one of those situations where he was telling me, he said, I really enjoy the work and the company and everything, but he said, I almost didn't accept the offer, not because the rate wasn't, the salary wasn't good or people weren't good. But if this is the way that an organization is going to work, I don't know if I'm going to be able to work with a company like this, especially for building out processes and SOPs and everything else that ultimately would follow in his remit. So, I think if we're not careful in our intentionality and intent of trying to be perfect, trying to be exact. And again, there we work with brilliant scientists who need to get it right in everything else that they do. So like I don't fault anybody, but if we're not careful, we can begin to build a culture that no matter how great your organization is and the current people are and the work that you're doing and things of that nature, you may be working a little bit against yourself. If your processes really aren't attuned to what the candidate experience really looks like.
Sean, can you recall a time where you had a candidate in process with a client, and all clients are valued as well as the candidates, top talent we get to work with. But through the process, perhaps amber or red flags started to pop up from a candidate side because you've done your due diligence, not only from a technical perspective, but also from a cultural perspective. And perhaps you identified that they would not be the right fit. Has there been that type of scenario? And then how did you consult the client that the candidate wouldn't be right?
It does happen from time to time. I think we are very, I know, pun intended, thorough in our process, of how we vet candidates and how we work our way through that process. But you're right, Darren, there are things that come along the way. And it's always interesting because we do our best to dig deep, build entire kind of organizational, I don't know, you'd call it like a portfolio of like what type of candidate works here, what type of candidate doesn't work here, what type of strengths and things do they have within their culture that we know we need to target when we're speaking to candidates. But yeah, when we do have to pivot into that space, it is our job first and foremost to advocate for everyone involved in the process, because at the end of the day, reputation is everything. And we would much rather pull the plug during the interview process than it would be, after an offer's extended, after everything else happens in the other side of things. We would not be doing our job if we didn't do it. And so, yeah, I can think of a couple of times, over the last year where we've had, candidates in process. I'm thinking about, a pretty senior level role that we worked on last year where we were working through the process, and just even from the candidates' feedback from some of the interview steps, it really set up for us, I wouldn't say a red light, but just enough where we said, you know what, like I'm going to save both parties here, from a relationship that's not going to work. And honestly, the candidates are always thankful, the clients are always thankful. And I think, that's why we don't just submit one candidate and hope. I think that's really focused around, being very intentional, but knowing that there may be two, three, four really great options for our clients. And so it's our job to own that entire process front to back, rather than just, hoping that it all works out. But I know there's a couple of examples we've talked about recently on your side
Yeah,
of the fence where you've needed to
yeah,
jump in there.
yeah, definitely, definitely. Wow. Such a good topic and relevant. I just attended a networking event earlier this week where this was one of the key topics that were being discussed. And I mentioned it a little bit earlier in the podcast, but in a moment of time in this season where we know there's a lot of layoffs, acquisitions, that are happening, culture is even more imperative. It's even more important um, because there's a lot of options.
Yeah.
And so I encourage our clients and our clients that we're going to be working with to keep that on the forefront, because that's the fastest way for, if you don't have a solid culture, to prevent you from hitting your milestones and those significant
Yeah.
goals that are set forth.
Absolutely. Well, hey, as we wrap today, I'd love it if you could maybe give two or three thoughts for clients around, key cultural things to pay attention to, make sure that you're keeping an eye on. And then for candidates, for things to pay attention to throughout the interview process and as they're reading through things on a company, to pay attention to really make sure that both parties are able to establish, both great culture on the hiring side and identifying great culture from a candidate's perspective.
Yeah, I'll start with the clients first. Sean, having worked with so many companies throughout my career, I've seen misalignment. And when I say misalignment, it's misalignment from the vision and the goals versus the culture that they're hiring for. So, first and foremost, without having that clear vision, without having those clear goals first established, that's when you can align culture. So, ensure that your culture is aligned to your vision and goals, right? So I know it sounds pretty straightforward and basic, but I've seen so much misalignment where the inputs that is being asked from the colleagues within the organization do not align with the vision or goals that they've set forth. So it's good to review that on a quarterly basis and not just kind of look at that at the end of the year or the beginning of the year. So first and foremost,
Yep.
for candidates, it's important to know what you're not looking for in your next role, in your next chapter in your career. In this day and age, people are really quick to jump into something and then they don't last. So instead of focusing on what you're looking for, take time, meditate on it, really process, synthesize on the things you're not looking for in your next company, and then ensure that there's alignment there.
Yep.
And so I think those are two big things. And I don't know if there's a third question, but I think those are the two main buckets. But we're here at Thorough Group, we're really obsessed about not only aligning from a technical, from an aptitude, from a really kind of a core competency perspective, but also from those power skills that I was talking about as well. So yeah, Sean, really in summation, I would say those three things are true.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I love what you said about really, deciding. I think even in this last year, I know I've talked to a lot of candidates who are less than 12 months in to their current role and they look back and say, "Man, I missed this. This wasn't something that I caught." And, now they are, looking for new roles and new opportunities because, they didn't take the time in their last search to really identify what those key things were for them. And they jumped in and they went, man. And, no one wants to, be making career changes quickly and things of that nature. But, it's something that is enormously valuable to really evaluate what you're looking for, what it is that matters the most to you and then run full steam after it. Well, Darren, I think it's been a really informative episode today. I think really something that's worth talking about and worth really, as you mentioned, kind of meditating and percolating on to make sure that in all of the other efforts that we're doing, that we are, making sure that we have the non-negotiables, we have the things that, we're willing to tolerate, when we have the things that we're really looking forward to. And so I think it's been a really helpful episode, and I hope it helps a lot of our audience members as well. If this is something that's really interesting to you, we'd appreciate if you share or comment, share anything below. But until then, Darren, I think there's one key aspect for us to continue to be thoroughly thriving.
We got to be able to work as one and win as one.
Come
We'll
on.
see you next time.
Thank you for joining us today for another great episode of Thoroughly Thriving. If you enjoyed today's episode, please feel free to share it with those in your world. If you'd like to learn more about the Thorough Group, please go to thoroughgroup.com. And remember that we will all remain thoroughly thriving if we continue to work as one and win as one.